Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your patience in holding. We now have your presenters in conference. Please be aware each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. You may submit your questions electronically anytime by using the Q&A pod located to the left of your webinar platform. You may also download a copy of today's presentation using the Resources pod located directly below the Q&A pod. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, AHA moderator, John Regi. Sir, you may begin.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this very important, timely, and hopefully you'll find very substantive webinar on improving cybersecurity for critical access in rural hospitals. This is John Regi, your National Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk from the American Hospital Association. So we've got a very excellent panel of experts with us today, both from representing rural hospitals and also representing Critical Insights. We'll go through the threat landscape a bit, and then you'll hear directly from our panelists on that frontline perspective, and most importantly, give you hopefully very useful guidance that you can use to help mitigate the threat that we're all facing. Again, John Regi, National Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk, formerly with the FBI, retired there after 28 years, and in my last assignment, my responsibility was to develop mission-critical relationships with private sector. And I'll let each of the panelists here talk a little bit about themselves. Mike, let's start with you.
Thank you, John. So Mike Hamilton, and I have been in the information security business in one way or another for about 32 years. I've held roles a lot in government as the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Seattle, as a Vice Chair of a Homeland Security Government Coordinating Council for Infrastructure Protection. In the private sector, I was the Managing Consultant for VeriSign Global Security, and I hope to bring perspective not so much from the government side of my career, but as the founder of Critical Insight, which is a service provider to the health sector in particular.
Thanks, Mike. Jason, over to you.
I'm Jason Povey. I'm the Chief Information Officer of Powell County Hospital. I have 25 years experience in a variety of sectors ranging from local governments to small business to Fortune 500, and just here to provide some insight.
Thanks, Jason. And Jonathan.
Thanks, John. Yeah, this is Jonathan Inskeep. I've been in healthcare for 15 plus years, have background in computer forensics and also data science with AI/ML. Been in the hot seat for quite a few years, and so really excited about today's conference and being able to participate, so thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And we again appreciate the support for Critical Insights in sponsorship of this webinar, and truly all the support that you've been giving the nation's hospitals, especially our rural and critical access hospitals. Critical Insights is a preferred cybersecurity provider for the American Hospital Association, providing these services here. So once again, thanks for your support in helping us disseminate important cyber information and, again, the skills that you bring. So let's talk about the national cyber threat landscape as I see it. For the past month and a half, just in the past month and a half, I've been traveling the country and probably have spoken to about 300 different hospitals between presentations and actually speaking to them. And unfortunately, this nationwide cyber threat that we all face equally, whether you are a critical access hospital or a multi-state, multi-billion-dollar system, again, we're facing all of this equally. And let's see here. And one of the things I like to check to get a pulse of where we are in terms of the current cyber threat environment is I check the government's website, HHS Office of Civil Rights, to kind of track the trends that we're seeing. And you see here in 2020, we had reported to the Office of Civil Rights breaches, hacks actually, impacting 27 million individuals. That went up by 60% in 2021 to 518 hacks, impacting 43 million individuals. Unfortunately, we're on track to meet last year's record number of individuals being impacted. So just as of last week, as of Monday, we had 272 breaches reported. And impacting 19.5 million individuals. Now, one of the things we want to stress here is that over 95% of these breaches are external hacks. These are hacks emanating from foreign cyber adversaries. These are not compromise or theft of data from employees. There's been some discussion in the media that the insider threat for healthcare is greater than the external threat. That's just not true. The data doesn't support that. Again, foreign adversaries based primarily in non-cooperative foreign jurisdictions such as Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And what we see is that these hacks that are being reported that are occurring take three different forms, generally three different forms. And mainly what we're seeing here is the, let's see here as the slides advance, the trend that we're seeing again, 19.5 million. You see that the trend line here, we're probably going to break the 2021 record. One of the major issues that we're very concerned about are ransomware attacks, which disrupt and delay healthcare and risk patient safety. Just recently, last week, the federal government, the FBI, CISA, and Treasury Department issued an urgent warning concerning the North Korean deployed malware known as the Maui ransomware. So one of the reasons we're very concerned about the North Korean threat here, in particular for ransomware, is that North Korea was attributed with disseminating the global ransomware known as WannaCry in 2017. That had a very disruptive effect on healthcare globally, and in fact was responsible for taking down about 35% of the hospitals, the hospital networks in the UK. Then we have many hospitals here in the U.S. Is disrupted as well. The other concern, of course, we have is that the ongoing Russian invasion of the Ukraine could actually have impact to U.S. healthcare. A lot of organizations say, John, why would the Russian government target a critical access or rural hospital in the United States? And the issue is that they would not intentionally target our hospitals, but we are concerned about the spillover effect, as happened also in 2017 when the Russian military intelligence service deployed ransomware known as NotPetya, which then spread to U.S. healthcare through third-party relationships. It impacted a bunch of hospitals and some major third-party service providers such as Nuance Communications, which again disrupted U.S. healthcare. I think one of the major issues that we're seeing about all these reported hacks is in fact that the majority of cyber threat that we're seeing, which results in the theft or compromise of bulk data, is coming through third parties. Here we see just in the recent couple of weeks major compromises and theft of protected health information coming from third providers. Many of these are mission critical. We have Shields, PFC, MCG, which are responsible for, at least now at this point, the largest number of reported breaches to OCR, largest number in terms of theft of protected health information. The other concern that we have about these third-party cyber risk impacting hospitals is that the third parties are used as a digital pathway into our hospitals, again, including small and rural hospitals. Then, as you see here, managed service providers, which many of our critical access and rural hospitals depend upon to provide services that they're just unable to provide themselves. Even Russian intelligence services went after our ubiquitous common VPN connections, again, looking for those vulnerabilities as the pathways into our networks. More sophisticated attacks, generally by nation states, include software and hardware supply chain attacks. China, responsible for compromised Microsoft Exchange. The Russian government intelligence service, responsible for the SolarWinds compromise. Again, very, very common software found in organizations of all types, from the very small to the largest organizations, and including government agencies. What we're also very concerned about now is that when a mission-critical business associate becomes victim of a ransomware attack, this raises lots of concerns, especially for small and rural hospitals, critical access hospitals, because again, we are dependent upon a lot of outside providers to provide those services for us. Unfortunately, the bad guys have mapped our interdependencies in healthcare and understand that if they go after a mission-critical service provider, such as Electa, such as Omnicell and Kronos, they will have a disruptive effect throughout the entire sector. Probably a good time to point out that we all, as an industry, as a sector, suffer from these cyber attacks, especially these highly disruptive ransomware attacks, but the impact for a small or critical access hospital can be outsized. For instance, some of our most recent ransomware victims for small and critical access hospitals may be located in an area where the next nearest emergency department is over 100 miles away. So if the emergency department gets shut down by a ransomware attack, it really does have a disruptive effect, not only on the hospital, but the entire community. The surrounding hospitals, the nearest one is going to have to pick up that slack, but most importantly, what we're concerned about is the delay and disruption to healthcare delivery, which risks patient safety. Again, these attacks are not just on the individual hospitals or the data. We consider these threats to life crimes because of the delay and disruption to healthcare. So when we talk about developing those third-party risk management programs, really to think about it in a strategic way. Identify those third parties that are holding bulk data or have access to your data. Which one of those third parties that you deal with are life-critical, mission-critical, and business-critical? What type of network access do they have? Where are their subcontractors located? All of these issues would increase risk and, of course, cyber risk, and we would, of course, recommend that the business associate agreement, that the cybersecurity and insurance requirements scale with the level of risk for these third parties. You should not have boilerplate language that apply to all third-party vendors, whether they are your Band-Aid supplier or your billing and coding vendor. So the business associate agreement, those contractual requirements, should scale with the level of identified risk. So that's just the scene setter here. And Mike and the team on the panel here, let me turn it over to all of you here to get your perspective on what you're seeing with the threats. And again, as those frontline net defenders, how you have to deal with that. Mike?
Sure. Yeah. So I've just got a few bullet points here for us to kind of mull over, and I'm interested in the perspective of Jonathan and Jason as to how well their own experience maps to what I'm seeing with our portfolio of health sector customers and some of the things that I do in terms of pulling in open source intelligence and things like this. First of all, you're broke. Okay, we know that. And it's really about the very tight margins that you just have to live under. When we all went, receded into our corners for COVID, telehealth became very important, and the deployment of medical IoT has continued apace. So this keeps making, to John's point, what we're talking about is a lot of hacks. That this wasn't unintentional loss of information when we're talking about all this records loss. They were hacked. And so the more you expand that technology envelope under which you operate, the more chances there are for somebody to wedge their way in. So that continues. Especially in rural areas, there is no possibility of finding, top shelf cyber people. The education of folks is starting to really pick up steam, and so this problem may be abated soon, but right now there is no access to qualified practitioners. And what I have heard, and I think this is particularly a good question for Jason Jonathan, if you develop somebody internally to be the security resource, after a while that security resource goes and gets a higher paying security job and you need to start over. And I've heard that over and over again. Rural health in particular is a favored target of organized crime because of all of these other reasons. And again, to John's point about what's going on geopolitically in the world, with Ukraine and Russia being at odds with one another, and all of the volunteers that are hacking Russia right now, their space agency, their propaganda ministry, they've taken over TV stations to broadcast their own stuff. Russia is irritated at that. And they blame the U.S. for that, rightly or wrongly. And so some of that is coming back our way. Some of that is in the form of volunteers that are doing the same thing on behalf of Russia as our volunteers are doing on behalf of Ukraine. But hospitals and the health sector are looked at as a punitive target. If you can affect the health sector in the United States, that creates a perception on the part of people that, things just don't work here. And that has always been a strategic objective of Russia. So all these things are going on right now. So I'm interested, Jason, specifically, when you try to fix your own security problems and develop your own staff, are they sticky? Do they hang around?
Usually they don't. And one of the things I really recommend is for you to be involved with your peer hospitals throughout your region and develop skills and network with them. That's a great resource. But the common thing that we're seeing through all my peers and everybody else is you have a senior guy, you have a junior guy. As soon as the junior guy has any skills whatsoever, they're such a hot commodity, they move on elsewhere. And that's really putting a stress on your senior level staff because they're taking the brunt of all the problems. And the other thing with the margins and budgets is we keep getting mandated with, hey, you need to implement this, and now you need to implement this, and you need to secure this, and you have to have MFA, and our margins are so tight that we can't secure all these resources to make that happen.
Jonathan?
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement with Jason. Working in my experience, it really kind of is the hot seat. I mean, you've got regulation through the healthcare sector that really, screws the bolts and tightens them up really on you, that you need to get these accomplishments taken care of. Staff is ever a burden to try and find somebody. One of the other things too is working with, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it comes to education. But you've got older team members in administration where they really see IT as just a service, and anymore in today's environment, IT ends up being in a hospital part of patient safety and patient care. And so trying to turn the tables on them on an educational level to be able to tell them, it's like, hey, you know what, this really matters. Like, everything we do now is all electronic. We got to put more in funding into IT. You need to kind of consider us as patient care safety, indirect patient care safety, and then really help us try to find that talent pool, because being in that responsibility as a CIO, it's stressful, because right off the bat that you just don't have the resources at hand to accomplish everything that needs to be done.
Yeah, and one of those things is third-party risk management, and John was right to spend some good time going through that and talking about how to do that, right? The vendor that supplies something that's mission critical to your organization deserves a higher look. And, when we are talking about nearly 50% of at least the records loss is coming through business associates, and I think the most recent one was professional services company, and that affected something like 600 covered entities. So wait for the class action suit, because it's coming. But if you're in a rural setting and you do have tight margins and it is hard for you, do you have any solutions or secrets that you use for third-party risk management where you can adequately do this? Because I would imagine the number of vendors that you need to engage with is at least in the hundreds. Jason?
It is, and every time you implement one program, you have to analyze the impact for everything else that's connected to it. And so if someone comes, hey, I need to implement this, and everybody expects that, hey, this should be a one-week solution when it takes a month for the resources to make sure that all the interdependencies and interfaces and everything else is secure with everything throughout your system. It's a challenge.
Yeah. Yeah. Jonathan, how did you do third-party risk management? Got any secrets?
Secrets is to be very proactive, I guess you could say, because it's so hard to be in that situation because you're so dependent upon that third party to bring services to your hospital and or needed services. And part of that problem is everybody wants it now. And we see that all throughout the technology sector, that everybody wants it now. They're not too concerned about security. And so security ends up being fallen by the wayside. And so that's where being in that position, you need to be proactive, really look over the objective and how's this going to be the best solution to implement into your environment. Do you have it separated, segmented on your network enough that it's not going to cause impact? What are the risks known with connecting with that third-party vendor? And you're going to have unknowns because they can come to you and say, hey, we know you guys want this service. We're going to connect into you, but we have no control on their back end of how their security is or their functions and stuff like that. And I agree with what John is saying is the generic BAA was 10 years ago. You really need to have it customized for the clientele that you're actually working with currently and understand the risks involved.
Yeah.
One other thing is there's so many new vendors in the space that there's not a history of reputations on a lot of them. There's so many startups that are, hey, we can get you a great deal on this service, and then there's holes and vulnerabilities, and you have to change to someone else anyway.
Yeah. So just quickly, I'll give you a little bit of a process that we've implemented for some of our customers. It's a 4-tiered process. So depending on the risk represented by your third parties, your vendors, your service providers, they either need to supply a high trust certification or an ISO certification, something that's kind of the top of the food chain. If they are very, very high risk, for example, if they're going to be actually handling customer records, going down one level, we expect them to provide us a SOC 2 report. That's an audited report on controls. If they are further down the risk chain, we'll ask them for a third-party assessment report against a standard we recognize, for example, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And if they're way, 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 way down at the bottom and they haven't done any of that stuff, here's our god-awful questionnaire. And the questionnaire should be the last resort, not the first resort, but the questionnaire is a self-assessment. Self-assessments are aspirational. An audited report on controls is the expectation for high-risk vendors. So that's the kind of process we put into place for our customers. Let's talk about some solutions here, because I think that's what people came to see. We don't have any money. How do we do this? So here's just a few bullet points here, and I know we have other things to talk about too. I just wanted to throw a bunch of these on here. This is a good one. Limiting external communication capabilities with staff. Do you really need external email in your job? Because if you don't get it. And aligned with that, a policy of personal use on a personal device. When I was the information security officer for the city of Seattle, I could prove that 40% of the compromises in the network came from the use of personal email. So if personal email all lives on people's phones, 40% of the problem just went away. Obviously, multi-factor authentication everywhere. That's our mantra today. If you have mobile terminals, physician tablets, things like that, or people that work from their phones, mobile data management is good. These are not cheap solutions, some of these. Definitely manage vulnerabilities, especially remote access methods. Those are the ones that are being pummeled with password guessing, credential stuffing, and things like that as an easy way in. Monitor everything, because preventive controls fail. And if you see the signal of preventive controls have failed, you have an opportunity to put out the grease fire on the stove before the house is engulfed in flames. Develop and practice incident response. There are incidents that the help desk can clean up, and there are incidents that the attorneys and the finance people need to be at the table. So having a set of playbooks for what could go wrong, and let's practice this, real good advice. And then finally, the insurance issue, right? Review that for coverage and exclusions. And exclusions right now are really trying to get around the act of war, right? So to John's point, the NotPetya global attack, the WannaCry global attack, if you get caught up in something like that, through no fault of your own, you weren't targeted, but you became collateral damage. Is your insurance going to cover that? They might not. Good idea to go back and take a look at that. So why don't we open forum for a while here and talk about other ways that we can help folks solve problems without lots of spend. I know that for one thing, I'm a big proponent of trying to bring in interns and things like that and work with the local academic institutions so that you can start to bring people up and at least put eyes on glass and have them monitor things. So, what kind of solutions can we think of that we can throw out for everybody?
Hey, Mike, just a couple, before we move on to that too, just a little bit of a commentary on some of your points that you made. First, on the personal email use, absolutely recommend that organizations limit staff access to personal email. We know the bad guys are actually doing social media reconnaissance, targeting individuals on their personal email to send those malware-laden phishing emails because they know they're going to check them on their corporate device, on their organizational device. So absolutely. And then, yeah, folks, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on both state and federal resources. The FBI has the InfraGard program for cross-sector information exchange. There's grant money out there, maybe not, that could be applied. I know some of our exercises have been funded by FEMA grants through the state hospital associations. But let me turn it back over to you guys, Jonathan and Jason, for your thoughts, how you're approaching this tremendous challenge.
One of the things that I try to do is use as many CIS controls as possible. You know, a lot of it can still be manual processes, but you can secure your network a lot that way. I know that with the version 7, there was a seminar where the numbers were, if you can implement the top 5, which is, you know, hardware inventory, software inventory, vulnerability management, admin privileges, you can really limit the vulnerabilities you have there. Another thing is, you know, attend all the free trainings that you can. You get a lot of great information from them. And then the partnership, you know, sign up for CISA, sign up for InfraGard, resources like that.
Yeah, I agree with Jason. I know we kind of followed the NIST standards and the CSI controls. There's just so much, and it's not just HIPAA. We don't just have HIPAA in the hospital, right? We have PCI and other compliances that are there. And so really one of the biggest challenges is actually finding a credible, reliable source to get information from. And there's a lot of great government sites, but at the same time, it's seeking out trusted partners in this market. I think that's one of the critical pieces because there's nobody that's going to be able to sit in that chair, especially in a critical access hospital, that's going to know everything. And so you have to go source that out, and you have to find somebody that you can build a relationship with and trust. And sometimes, you know, that leads into allowing services to be managed by another entity. And I know we're trying not to spend money here, but sometimes you need to realize that you can't do everything, that sometimes it's actually going to take assistance, reliance upon another company to kind of help assist you in that process.
I'm a big fan of open source tools, I got to tell you. Now, it does, you know, everything takes care and feeding, but there's a lot of things that can be used to solve problems, probably not at the, you know, in the best way possible, but adequately. So, for example, if you want to identify what's on your network, you can get a copy of, you know, Nmap and just map the network, and it does a reasonable job of telling you, you know, once it knocks on something's door, what that thing is. So Nmap is a nice tool. There's frankly, we brought up, Homeland Security, CISA, and their products and services. They will schedule a penetration test for you. They'll do a risk assessment for you. Now, it takes a while to get into their queue because there's a waiting list already, and this is one of the reasons why CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is part of DHS, is hiring like crazy to service everybody that's making requests for risk assessments and penetration tests, things like that. The grants, and maybe somebody, one of the attendees knows this, the state and local cybersecurity grant program is embedded in the IIJA, the Infrastructure Improvement and Jobs Act. Hospital districts may be in scope for those grants, and I have not been able to determine myself, but it seems that a hospital district is analogous enough to a local government that would be true, so maybe somebody can tell us about that. In some cases, the National Guard can help with things like penetration testing. They've done that in a couple of states. That's not universal. But I will say, too, that the bulletins that CISA continues to put out, and oftentimes they are in cooperation with the FBI and what are called the Five Eyes intelligence agencies, these are a great heads up that something may be headed your way. And so that threat intelligence combined with whatever you can be doing on the ground to move your focus over to where the current threat may be coming from and what vector they may use. Are they phishing your employees? Are they going after remote access methods? How are they doing this? That has been fairly effective, I think. And then I don't know, and maybe John, you know something about this, or Jason, Jonathan, you may have implemented something like this. The CIS, Center for Internet Security, is merged with the multi-state ISAC, Information Sharing and Analysis Center, and they have a platform called Albert that they can also deploy at low cost. And Albert will let you know if somebody on your network has reached out to touch someone on a bad list. It's a modicum of monitoring there. Lastly, I'll say managed services is always a fit for situations like this because you're going to have a lot of trouble staffing your own monitoring at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, and that's what managed services are good for. There's also another effort, a nonprofit called Pisces connects security monitoring for down-market organizations with universities that are teaching analysts. And so those university students are getting the benefit of operational experience with live fire while providing a no-cost resource for those customers or those data sharing partners. So those are a few ideas I have. I'm very interested to know whether or not someone's has intelligence on whether or not that grant program may be extended to hospital districts. And I see Darren is over here, and he's talking about Security Onion. That's a really, really great open source set of tools. Security Onion all comes together. Kali Linux is a bootable CD for assessing security as a penetration tester. The OWASP, OWASP, Open Web Application Security Program, is a bootable CD that's got application security testing tools on it. So there are quite a few of these, and in an absence of qualified professionals, dipping into the open source is not a bad way to go. So any experience with open source, anybody that you thought was good or not?
Mike, good points to make there. Again, a lot of that available, but just remember, I think we should take advantage of those open source items because the bad guys are as well. A lot of their exploits include common open source tools. They've moved from Cobalt Strike to some other tools right now as they are examining once they make penetration and so forth. So again, we should take advantage just as the bad guys are taking advantage of those open source tools. And the other comment I had is that obviously with reduced resources, there becomes increased reliance on technology and third parties. And when I speak to the CEOs, I say this, look, the vulnerabilities introduced by increased reliance on technology really twofold. One, the technology itself contains technical vulnerabilities which allow hackers to penetrate your network. Two, the dependency on that technology creates a risk when you have a loss of availability of that technology, such as during when a ransomware attack. And a lot of CEOs don't realize that, hey, your IT guy or gal can't fix Kronos' problem, that mission-critical third-party technology that you're dependent upon. So business continuity becomes a big issue. Love to hear from the group as well, and even from the audience, how you're approaching that business continuity plans as well. And just a reminder to the audience, feel free to throw questions in the chat. We will have some time here at the end for general Q&A. So back to the panel, Jason and Jonathan, for your commentary.
One thing that's on this slide is the develop and practice incident response. And one of the things that I've seen is we develop our incident response plan, but it's all centered around a few key people, and we need to really practice that response plan when those people are not available.
Good advice.
Exactly. Exactly. In every function.
Yeah, sorry, John. One of the other things I would say, though, too, for people, and you should know this, but even with CISA being such a great resource site and these other publications about things that are going on, those are the same things that the bad actors are actually using to glean information to figure it out. So you're on a kind of a tight rope to get security implementations and stuff put in place. And then you know, you really got to make sure that when you look at open source software, that you're getting it from a reputable location, because there's times where that open source software is actually been played with, and you can actually inadvertently bring malware into your organization. And then the third thing I would mention is really to sit down and review, what is your insurance company really going to do for you at a time when the fire is erupting in your hospital? What is their part? When does their part end? What's your responsibility to prove over that you have protective tools in place that have been utilized so they don't escape through a loophole and kind of leave you hanging? And there's resources that you can actually use through the government, through contacting your local FBI resource, and they can help develop a plan for responsiveness on that process too as well.
Yeah, and real quick, I want to hit this question Brenda is asking here. Is there a good place to go to get a list of some of these tools we were talking about, Security Onion, Nmap, OWASP, Live CD, things like that? Just Googling for open source security tools, you'll get a whole lot of those lists. And those are fairly easy to find. So Security Onion in particular, I would recommend taking a look at. Also something called the ELK stack, E-L-K, Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. That's the ELK stack. That allows you to put together your own monitoring stack with an unstructured database. So you can pull in logs and intrusion detection events. And by the way, intrusion detection sensor, IDS, great open source product called Suricata. Very, very good to use. Suricata events, again, you know, firewall blocks. I mean, you can ingest all of these things, and then you can mine the data with this tool called Kibana. So check out the ELK stack as well. All right, I'm going to keep us moving here. You know, in our business, it's cyber, scary Russian cyber buffer overflow, SQL injection all the time. We have more secret handshake language than anyone else. When I speak to executives in particular, I like to boil this down in terms of avoidable outcomes that cost money and really try to reduce things into as few buckets as possible. So in terms of boards, if you need to speak with your board and you need to impress someone with the fact that investments in security really need to be made in today's world, prepare, detect, respond. You know, this is kind of aligned with the NIST cybersecurity framework, which also is a great tool to use to assess yourself, come up with gaps in controls, use those to create a budget and a budget request or a grant request. But you know, this is really probably the simplest way possible to think about this. And then finally, if you choose Critical Insight as a partner or somebody else, it doesn't matter. Look for a portfolio of services that can plug in all the gaps that you have. Not one vendor for managed detection and response, and another vendor for helping you with your governance and budgeting, and another vendor to do your security awareness training. Consolidating that into the fewest number of vendors is good advice, because vendor proliferation only makes that third-party risk management worse. So with that, let's go straight up Q&A here. So John, I'm going to turn this back to you and let you guide the QA.
Great. So there are so many points that you touched on, Mike, Jonathan, and Jason, that we could go on for hours here. But an interesting point, let me just follow up when you talked about the managed service providers, security providers. We know the bad guys are after MSPs because we're increasing reliance on them as that hub and spoke attack method. If they get access to the hub, they get access to all the spokes, meaning the customers. So I know that, so that's, again, one of the areas you're going to have to check in the business associate agreement. And Mike, you know that I did your vetting personally for your organization, and we obviously would not have confidently recommended you if we didn't feel you were secure. But it's an ongoing process. So you want to have that, have those requirements also require, the business associate agreement require any change in status that the customer should be notified. But let's, talking about new vendors, you bring somebody on new. Gentlemen, let me open this up to all of you. What are the best practices you're using to bring on new vendors? What's your standard that you would use, both from a technical analysis and then again that the cybersecurity requirements?
Yeah, I told you mine, so I'll defer on this one. It's that 4-tiered, here's what we want from you that we're going to evaluate.
Jason, you're on their front line. Let me go to you next and then over to Jonathan.
A lot of it is just reputation and word of mouth. You see them at a conference, you know one of your friends that have them implemented, you have a working relationship with a vendor and trust their recommendations. It's really hard with being a small rural place to know all the latest and greatest, so we really depend on the peer networking.
Yeah, clearly an oversaturation in the cybersecurity market right now. That's why we're trying to, through organizations like Critical Insights and our program, help distinguish that signal from the noise. And there's a lot of noise out there. Jonathan, what are your thoughts? How do you sift through that plethora of cybersecurity vendors out there?
I actually think that's a huge challenge. I think the peer infrastructure, like Jason alluded to, is actually a really great structure for us to utilize. Small hospitals, you really only have the opportunity to do it once and hopefully do it correctly. This is where maybe like working with a larger hospital, kind of looking at the things that they're doing. Go take tours, talk with their security teams, go take tours, find things that are actually working for them. And then when you work with vendors and stuff like that, really get to know your vendor. I've worked with some vendors in the past where the relationship started off fantastic, and then it would turn. And then the next thing you know, you're being nickeled and dimed to death, and you're like, wow, I really can't continue this relationship because, I want you to stay in business, but you're putting me out of business, right? And so it's really doing the educational piece like Mike talked about. How qualified is this vendor to actually help serve you? And I can tell you that through trial and error, unfortunately, that there was plenty of times where that vendor did not fulfill its initial response to one of our needs, and so that really puts you in a predicament as a CIO trying to lead your hospital of finding the right solution that's going to be effective. And there's been some solutions that have been fantastic when we put them in place, but there's still missing parts and pieces of the puzzle, right? And then sometimes when you put these solutions in place at a hospital, it ends up taking more of your time than what it would have been to find a better solution or like a managed service, right? So it's really a hard challenge, and it's really nice when you can connect on a peer level with others to pick their mind and not just take it verbatim that I saw you guys had a nice website.
Exactly. 2 points I want to emphasize, I may have mentioned earlier, that whatever requirements you put in place for whatever type of vendor that you have, cybersecurity or otherwise, they must be contractual, or else you will not have any means of recourse to make them comply. And of course, that those initial cybersecurity and insurance requirements at the time, those are a snapshot. That's a snapshot in time. How often are the third parties reviewed for the risk that they pose? They may have started off as one service, and then a business unit, a operational unit, then expanded their service to include billing and coding. And now they have the treasure trove of data. So, Mike, you talked a lot about multi-factor authentication. And by the way, as it intersects with insurance, quite frankly, my opinion is, and from what I've heard from the industry, you are not insurable unless you have multi-factor authentication in place. I think that's become the first bar for cyber insurance underwriters. But how do you implement or require, mandate multi-factor authentication for vendors? Mike, your thoughts? I'll start there with you and then back over to the group.
Right. So I have no compunction at all about requiring multi-factor authentication from my vendors. What I want to do is I want to see an audited set of controls that demonstrates that that's in place, and an auditor has looked at that. I mean, this is table stakes now. And it doesn't need to be that I am driving that, because you made the key point, John. So way back in the 20th century, if you take credit cards, you are regulated by the payment card industry, PCI. Health records, obviously, it is HIPAA. Criminal justice information services, CJIS, right? If you produce energy, it's the NERC Critical Infrastructure Protection Standards. And so there has been this set of regulatory requirements that people have to meet in certain sectors. That's all out the window, because today the de facto regulator for every sector is the insurance industry. And so I don't need to stand on my vendors' necks to make sure that they're getting multi-factor authentication done right, because I know the insurance company is doing that. And if they're not insured, and to your point about contractual requirements, that is a contractual requirement. You must have this type of insurance. So we are, to a certain extent, being given a gift by the insurance industry, saying we are going to go out and adjudicate all these controls on your behalf so that we understand the risk of the insured. So, you know, again, we have audited controls that we can show our potential customers. That's what they want to see, and it says we have multi-factor authentication there, etc. I don't think that I would even allow, or I would object as the information security officer for our business, if someone wanted to engage a marketing firm that was willy-nilly, everybody has personal laptops, nobody uses multi-factor, it's not going to happen. So there needs to be a gatekeeper. Here, that's me, and the process we use is that four-tiered process that I talked about.
Thanks, Mike. Jason, again.
Just one thing on the MFA is the evolution of MFA. You know, when it first came out, everybody's, hey, let's send an SMS, text message to your phone. And now with all the SIM cloning going on, everybody's pushing, hey, you better use an authenticator app. So just keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, and I will say this, in a hospital setting, and you guys know this much more than me, but it is my assumption that physicians and their mobile tablets and things like that are very resistant to things like multi-factor authentication, probably rightly so. Is that an ongoing argument, conversation? What is that?
Well, you actually jumped on what I was going to say, Mike, because part of that is being, and any product that you bring into a hospital is you've got to get buy-in, because those are the staff members that are going to be using it. Those are your daily customers. You've got to get buy-in. And so what we found for like multi-factor authentication, when we looked across the market for that piece specifically, we looked at how it's going to impact providers and our clinical staff, and how simple is it going to be. We ended up going with a push notification through SMA partner that has those data source logs and stuff like that. So we have a repository, so when it came up to an auditing event, right, we could show that, yes, they were set up on a device. Yes, this was their device. We have an audit log of that device being used for them to get in and out of our gateway. But at the same time, we had to get that buy-in. And that buy-in is so critical because if you don't get the buy-in from your staff, and we know providers can sometimes be very particular, then it's not going to work inside your hospital. It's going to be a flop in your environment. And so when we looked at the market, that's where really that notification push was really the simplest way to help allow our organization to function. That way we could take out the remembering numbers, trying to transpose numbers into the system and stuff like that. But buy-in is a huge piece in any technology event that you do inside an organization.
I totally agree, Jonathan. As I talk to hospitals around the country, that's always the dilemma, is balancing security and convenience. Clinicians say obviously they'll need access quickly to patient data or medical devices. But I think the conversation is turning. I see it across the C-suite and with the clinicians that all are starting to understand that cyber threats are not just an IT issue, a data protection issue. It's about patient safety. And many, many organizations now equate cyber hygiene with medical hygiene in terms of protecting the patient. We've seen it. Hospitals go offline, ambulances being diverted, no telemetry, no radiology. It really increases the risk for a negative outcome. And according to CISA, strong correlation to excess deaths. So we know it's raising in priority. Let's move on here. And by the way, I want to remind the audience, again, feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Budgets, right? So we talk about, are people putting the money where their mouth is, in a sense? Are the budgets increasing to match the priority level increasing? And how do you determine what security budget is adequate and appropriate for a given organization? It's lots of variables. Jason, how about over to you for that?
One of the things that I've noticed is if there's a hospital association conference or anything like that where they're talking cybersecurity, invite your board members, invite your C-suite to get into these sessions. I know we attended one with John, and I had my CFO, CEO, and a board member there, and that made a big world of difference. Of, hey, now they understand the threats. It's not just hearsay. They're physically there, and it's helped increase the budget a little bit. Well, one of the real difficult things, people say, oh, it should be 5% of your budget or 7% of your budget, but some of us are working with real small budgets where that's just not enough, and it could end up being 15 or 20% of your budget.
Yeah, totally agreed. It depends on your posture, right? What is your current posture? Lots of variables on how expenses are classified. Jonathan, from your perspective, again, how do you see, or how would you determine what would be an adequate cybersecurity budget?
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to you really need to do that security risk analysis at your location. You need to know what your risk points are, right? Because that's going to set you up for the educational piece that's going to need to go in front of the board and the C-suite and say, hey, these are our risks that we're running with at the hospital. These are the things that we need to try and cover. We've done this research. We feel that this utility, this software, this tool will actually help supplement and reduce some of this risk. But the educational piece is critical, but you can't educate on anything unless you have that security assessment done. And that security assessment is your roadmap for things that you've got to prioritize to get completed in your hospital. And it's not easy. And sometimes you're going to choose something that has a higher priority, even though that's you still have some lower hanging fruit that is a really good choice too as well. Sometimes you have to take a higher priority to reduce maximum amount of risk just to try and cover it with these tight budgets that we're allotted.
Right. Jonathan, great points. It's a risk decision and discussion, basically. So that cyber risk is truly that enterprise risk issue, and ultimately a lot of it comes down to the risk tolerance and acceptance of the organization. But again, equating it with patient care and patient safety, I think, brings things into a new light. Mike, I know you have a comment probably, I'm sure, on this discussion, this point.
Well, I'm not as qualified as our other panelists, to speak from experience, but I do see in open source reporting, just in the news, that budgets are ticking up, and it's largely in response to just the threats ticking up. I don't think anybody is trying to proactively just be the best they can be with security. I think it's a response to what's happening. So about 7% of the IT budget, pretty close to what Jason said, is what I have seen as kind of the standard. But again, I'm gonna agree with Jonathan here. If your budget should be determined by where your risk is, and a methodical way of going about that, like taking the NIST framework, going through that, finding your control gaps or the outcomes that you don't meet, because it's an outcome-based framework. It's not prescriptive with respect to controls. It says make something happen, right? Remote access is managed. Doesn't say how to do it. You've got to get it done some way. And so how you fix that is up to you and the resources that you have. But if you game all that out, find all your gaps, figure out if we're going to solve this problem ourselves with internal labor, we're going to hire consulting, we're going to make a capital purchase. There's 3 easy buckets of cost that you can associate, and you can estimate the budgetary needs for the gaps you need to close. And then you can prioritize those on risk, and you can say, here's a 2-year roadmap of things I need to do in security. That's one way to go about it. I think that's rather than the global average of 5 to 7% of the IT budget, that's a much better way to go about it. Your budget should be really aligned with your needs.
I totally agree.
I would just like to chime in really fast on that too, as well as IT in the hospital should maybe take the lead on some of these issues because it's not the wheelhouse of some other departments in the organization, but this is really an organizational initiative. It's not just, well, it's IT's responsibility. This is an organizational-wise, your C-suite needs to be involved, your HR needs to be involved for how you're going to respond when playbooks and stuff happen. I mean, this is a hospital commitment. Your employees don't use personal email on company products. Don't find ways to circumvent the securities that are in place at the hospital just because you want to watch a YouTube video. I mean, it really is an organization putting cybersecurity at first to help try and keep that hospital safe.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jonathan. I mean, ultimately, I think it's incumbent upon the IT professionals to translate that technical risk into operational risk. What's the impact of not having multi-factor authentication? The impact to patient care and safety, the impact to the protection and privacy and security of data. And I think once you start to put it in those terms, the C-suite starts to get it, right? Because these are business risk issues, operational risk, legal and regulatory risk, and ultimately, again, patient care and patient safety risk issues. There's a comment in the chat box I wanted to expand upon. We have Althea, I think, Dennis, talking about the business continuity plans. Unfortunately, I've seen time and again across the nation where many organizations believe it's IT's responsibility to develop business continuity plans, not realizing that when there's a loss of technology, it is not up to IT to figure out how do we continue to deliver radiation oncology with a loss of technology? How do we pay people? How do we monitor home healthcare patients when we've lost internet due to a ransomware attack? So business continuity, what I like to call operational continuity and clinical continuity, requires the involvement of every function. Because again, IT may not be able to restore the functionality there within those departments. I'm not sure we have any other comments or questions, but in the last couple of minutes, gentlemen, I'd like to just turn it back to you for any quick closing comment, thought, or point that you'd like to stress. Mike, let me start back with you, and then we'll go to the net defenders.
Okay, so the one thing that I'll bring up is the good side of all of this, and that is the federal government has gotten into the fight. So the Department of Defense is melting bad guy networks, and the Department of Justice is identifying, extraditing, and prosecuting these individuals. The Treasury Department, through an existing authority called the Office of Foreign Asset Control, has made certain crypto exchanges off limits. You cannot use them because they are used for extortion payments. And the White House itself has changed the rhetoric around the use of ransomware against critical infrastructure like the health sector. So all these things are having a good pushback effect. Eventually they will, I think, beat this situation down a little more. And in fact, what we have seen now is a transition away from ransomware encrypting your network back to stealing your records. While it's hard to say that's a good thing, that's actually a good thing. Stealing records doesn't prevent you from treating patients, right? Ransomware does. So that's the point I'll make is luckily the federal government is now firmly on the side of the health sector.
Agreed. We in healthcare, security are defense, government is offense, as I often remind them. One team, one fight. Jason, 30 seconds. Any final closing thought?
The biggest thing is find an MDR partner. You can't do all this alone. You can't depend on one or two people to do it. You're going to get attacked on Saturday at 10 o'clock at night when your staff's not on call. So having the right partner is key and crucial to this outcome.
Thank you, Jason. Jonathan, 30 seconds. Final closing thoughts.
Yeah, along with all these great commentaries, which I appreciate, is also just ensure that you have organizational engagement and that education piece that's there, because that's where you're going to be able to get your wins in your job role as a CIO is being able to bring the information forward, being able to show these risks, and really having a team that's on board with you to help promote that cybersecurity inside your hospital.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all today for sharing your perspectives and great advice. And thanks to all of our viewers for what you do every day to defend your networks, care for patients, and care for communities. Stay safe, everyone. This has been John Rigi, your National Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes today's presentation. You may now disconnect.